Our 2024 NFL Draft Prospect Series shifts its focus to the defensive side of the ball for an unenviable task, replacing Christian Wilkins. Is there anyone in this class that would be up for the task? We're exploring three top names at defensive tackle here today on Locked On Dolphins.
You are Locked On Dolphins, your daily Miami Dolphins podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
All right, Miami, welcome to another episode of Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day here on the Locked On Network. I'm your host, Kyle Krabs, a lifelong Miami Dolphins fan, host of Locked On Dolphins, co-host of Locked On NFL Scouting. You can find our shows on YouTube or wherever you listen to your favorite podcast. Tip of the cap to our everydayers, because it is your team every day. We don't just say it, we live it here on the Locked On Network. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more right now. New customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 if your bet wins. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn to get started. And today is a day on the program where things get interesting. We've looked at wide receiver. We've looked at the offensive line, both inside and outside. And you come away from those studies, and there's some names you like. There's some names you would understand why they'd be the pick at 21. But really, for me, there was a player throughout the course of the past week's programming that stood head and shoulders above the rest as far as a candidate to sprint the card into and to pound the table for. But now you shift over to the defensive side of the football. And I've, looking at the defensive interior, found more than one talent that we're going to talk about on today's show, which I would be willing to pound the table for as well. And that's where Miami and their draft positioning at 21 gets exciting, because if there's a run on quarterbacks and there's a run on wide receivers and, you know, some of these other positions that maybe Miami's not super high in the running for, you could have several of these players on the board when it comes time to make a decision. And that's the best position you could possibly be in, is having your choice of as many tailored fits for what you want to do. So let's talk about these defensive linemen. And we'll start with Illinois defensive tackle Johnny Newton. And Johnny is a potential top 20 draft pick. Would not be surprised if he were to be picked by, say, the Rams to replace Aaron Donald. Right, Aaron Donald's retirement looms large over this year's first-round pick, and the Rams having a first-round pick for the first time in like 7 years. But for Miami's sake and Miami's purposes, they're searching for potential players to fill the void that's been left behind with Christian Wilkins and his departure in free agency. For $27.5 million per season, you understand why the team made the decision that they did. The needs of the many versus the needs of the few. And that's, I think, the most fascinating thing about Johnny Newton. The last 2 seasons of college ball, he's been an elite interior defensive lineman, and he's played over 750 snaps in each of the last 2 seasons. Over 725 snaps in each of the last 2 seasons. This is a volume snap taker. That's what Christian Wilkins was. That was the biggest gut punch of losing Christian Wilkins, was knowing that Johnny Newton, or was knowing that Christian Wilkins was leaving behind the kind of volume of snaps that you were going to have a really hard time filling with one individual player. Johnny Newton plays 700 plus snaps a season in 12 games. This is a guy who rarely leaves the field. Now, here's the profile on Johnny Newton. He is 6'1.5", 304 pounds, with 32 3/8 inch arms. So about 32.5-inch arms. He has not tested. Sounds like he had some kind of a foot issue that prevented him from testing at the combine as he recovered from that, but he will be testing, it sounds like, a little later this month for a personal pro day. Very productive pass rusher. His pass rush productivity in 2023 was not as robust as it was in 2022, in which he logged 36 hurries, 19 quarterback hits, and 4 sacks for a grand total of, 53 pressures total. And he had 43 total pressures in 2023 in one less game. The pass rush productivity and the pass rush nuance with Johnny Newton, I think, is what's the most exciting part of his game. I would venture to say he's a better pass rusher than Christian Wilkins is. Now, he's not as big as Christian Wilkins. He's not as consistent leveraging the point of attack. His pad level's not as consistent as Christian's was. He's not as good of a run defender as Christian Wilkins is. But this is a guy who moves all around the front. He's in the B gap, and he's outside, lined up over top of the tackle and a head-up alignment on a tackle, about 50-50 split % of the time in 2023. So you can play him in a 4, you can play him in a 3. He's primarily a B gap defender. You go back to 2022, in which he had more production. He spent a higher percentage of his snaps lined up over top of offensive tackles as compared to being inside alignment on a guard. But you see really good attacking of half a man, where I'm going to get out of the blocks. I'm going to hit you with a hand counter. I'm going to force you to have to play half of my body. And then I'm going to use my athleticism to get into those gaps and get hip to hip with you very quickly. And I'm going to be slippery with how I reduce my surface area and how I use my hands, or how I force you to throw a punch. And then I'm going to work back across your face. He does really good in horizontal run game to kind of get fit on somebody with the flow. And he tracks the ball carrier really well, where he'll be able to fall back off the block. If the back is pressing to the perimeter and sticks his foot in the ground and tries to bend back against the grain, that pursuit, that's where he wins a lot in the run game to make splash plays. Now, he's a penetrator at his core. And that's something for Miami when you think about Anthony Weaver and coming into this system and the kinds of guys that they have. Neville Gallimore can be that kind of player. He's never consistently been that kind of player. Zach Sealer can be that player. So the question is, do you want more of that, or do you want a different body type and skill set? Is having a high volume snap taker that valuable to you? In grading Johnny Newton, I have him coming into the league projected to be about one tier down below Zach Sealer and what Zach Sealer is as an NFL player right now, with ceiling to tap into to develop further and become a more impactful player. You know, he had 8 sacks this past season. I would not in the least bit be surprised if he's an 8+ sack guy annually at the NFL level. The pass rush palette is that good. And he's played over 1,400 snaps, almost 1,500 snaps the last 2 seasons combined, across 25 games, with over 100 pressures at his disposal playing in the Big Ten against some really good offensive lines, to be honest with you. I played against Penn State. He played against Wisconsin. And I would argue those were probably his 2 best games. He killed Minnesota. There's just a lot of splash and flash and disruption in his game. But I would say he's a better pass rusher than he is a run defender at this stage. But he is somebody that you feel can step in and play a high amount of volume. And if you're sound with all of your pieces around him for your run fit integrity and holding the line of scrimmage, he can be a player who falls off of blocks fairly well. This is a strong candidate for Miami at 21. Because again, I think the fall off from Christian Wilkins to whoever the next player is in line to step into that role right now is the biggest drop off on the roster. Maybe not like the highest, most pressing need, because Miami needs to get their offensive line figured out. And you got a bunch of other pillar players and cornerstones on defense that can help to mitigate that need, including Zach Sealer. But the biggest drop off in talent right now from where Miami was to where they are now is 94 versus whoever else is out there. And this is a dude that can play the snaps. That's a nice guy to have as an option if he gets to you at 21. We're going to contrast and compare him to Byron Murphy II from the University of Texas. I did 2 Texas defensive tackles to go along with Johnny Newton. Those guys are coming up next here on this episode of Locked On Dolphins. Stick with us. Today's episode of Locked On Dolphins is sponsored by BetterHelp. A lot of us spend our lives wishing that we had more time. The question is, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you choose to use it? The best way to squeeze that one special thing into your schedule is to know what is important to you so you can make it a priority. Therapy can help you find what matters so you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online. It's designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matches with a licensed therapist, and you can switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/LockedOn today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/LockedOn. Pretty glowing review for Johnny Newton, who I knew was a good player. But then you really get into the film and the deep dive, and I was just really blown away by what he was able to do these past 2 seasons, and seeing it in succession and how robust he is as a pass rusher. I think he'd be the best interior defensive line pass rusher on the roster if they added him at this stage. The same, I don't think I would say would be true for Byron Murphy from the University of Texas. But this is another player who I have graded very similarly as far as an option at 21 and what the appeal would be. So here's what I could say about Byron Murphy, the second from University of Texas. 6 foot and 1/2 inch. That's second percentile for height. So pad level and leverage is an obvious strength of his game. There's not a lot of guys that are going to get it underneath his pads. And he plays at about 300 pounds. He came into the combine at 297, which is 28th percentile for interior defensive line. Those numbers might not impress you. He has the same reach and arm length as Johnny Newton, 32 3/8 of an inch. How about a 4.87 40-yard dash with a 1.69 10-yard split? That is 91st and 83rd percentile, respectively, for interior defensive linemen to come through the NFL Combine since 2000. His 33-inch vertical jump at 297 pounds is the 88th percentile for all interior defensive linemen. His standing broad jump of 111 inches, which is 9 feet 3 inches, is 82nd percentile. Testing numbers are through the roof. So smaller, highly dynamic interior defensive lineman who I actually think is a better run defender than he is a pass rusher right now. He is, from a run defending perspective, because he's so low to the ground, it makes it so easy for him to sit under the point of attack and be able to get off the blocks when he wants to. When he wants to penetrate and be a gap penetration player, he does it at an extremely high level. That elite first step is very much present. And I think the one thing that Byron Murphy does better than Johnny Newton in the run game is that forward momentum, his ability to continue to keep his feet active and pressing for upfield momentum and push to kind of help him continue to press through contact a little bit more. As compared to Johnny, his wins as a pass rusher come from his first step, but it's really a lot of developed hand counters and stuff like that. Murphy, I think, wins in all phases with his feet a little bit better, and he's leveraged a little bit better. Both are really bendy guys. And I think the ceiling for Murphy to tap into as a pass rusher is as high as Johnny Newton. You see the flashes. He had a win against Washington with a really good hand counter where he got up on the wrist of the interior defensive lineman. It's called a lift technique, and he lifted that hand up in the air as he threw his head, as the blocker threw his hands to get his hand set on Murphy's frame. He catches his hand in midair at the wrist, and he just lifts it up in the air. When you lift like that, wrist control, it's the martial arts. Just the smallest, if you catch the right anatomical weak point, you can really manipulate somebody's body with a lot of ease. And he did that in real time in a pass rush instance that really popped off the screen at you. I had 45 pressures last year. So say what you will about the pass rush menu and the pass rush palette. He gets into the backfield, and he also anchors the run against double teams really well. Like, really impressive for a 300-pound player, what he is able to do. He played 438 snaps in 14 games last season. So he doesn't necessarily have the same volume of reps as Johnny Newton. In Texas, they rotated their guys a little bit more, so it's a little bit more understandable. They had, between TVondre Sweat as a nose tackle type player who could move all around the front, and then also some guys that they had behind him. They were a little more willing to take Murphy off the field for possessions at a time. But if I'm going to continue to contrast Murphy and Newton as players, Murphy actually did have a better pass rush win rate than Johnny Newton did. But I think some of that came as a byproduct of who he had a chance to play. When you consider Rice, Alabama's obviously, a standout game on the schedule. Baylor, Kansas, Oklahoma, Houston, BYU, Kansas State with Cooper Beebe, I guess is a meaningful game. Murphy played really well in that game. TCU, Iowa State, Texas Tech, Oklahoma State, and then Washington in the playoff. I just thought Johnny Newton played better teams, better offensive line units than Murphy did. But that's not to dismiss how Murphy has a ceiling of a pass rusher. I just didn't think he showed as vast of a menu of ways to win at first contact and with pass rush counters when your hands first get on you. But Murphy's ability to kind of play through lateral contact, also when you consider just how quick he is to be able to accelerate, and if the quarterback's worked off his spot, he had a number of really productive plays, Murphy did, where he works to his landmark and the quarterback either goes to step up in the pocket or looks to flush outside, and he gets on top of dudes in a hurry. Like he can really go from 0 to 100 really, really quick. So I think the floor as a run defender with Murphy is a little bit higher than what it is with Johnny Newton, and I think the ceiling is equally as high as a pass rusher as it is for Johnny Newton. So these are two players who I think would instantaneously be a top 2 player in the interior defensive line room if they were added to the ranks. And I think had the potential to be quality starters very quickly upon entrance to the league. So you add both of those guys into this conversation for what Miami can do with their first round pick at 21, depending on how the board breaks for you. You feel a little bit better about having like not one player or bust, which is not a world that I would want any fan to want to live in going into the draft, because there's hundreds of players, thousands of players eligible. So to be only one player or die is a really hard way to go into a draft and come out the other side of it and be happy. I would be happy with either one of these two names being added to the Dolphins ranks. Completely different kind of player in TVondre Sweat is where we're going to spend the last bit of our time here on today's show. That's next. Stick with us. The sports calendar is loaded in April, and FanDuel is making it even more exciting for you to get in on the action right now. New customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you could spend on betting the tourney, Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL, and so much more. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make your first big bet a win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. The last name that I'm going to invoke here is certainly not a player that I would advocate for Miami to draft at pick number 21. But this is a player I would love to see Miami add to their ranks as well. When you consider the current nose tackle situation and the lack of really exciting candidates. Obviously, the team brought back Benito Jones, and Benito played some meaningful snaps for Detroit last year, but how high is that ceiling? Is that really like the world that you want to live in? You can contrast that to Texas's TVondre Sweat, number 93. Totally different ballgame as a player. 6'4.5", 366 pounds, 33.25 inch arms. His wingspan of 81.25 inches is 77th percentile. His actual arm length is 52nd percentile. His weight at 366 pounds is 99th percentile, and his height is 83rd percentile for all interior defensive linemen since 2000 coming to the NFL Combine. This is a very large human being. I did a big, big, big man. But he played more snaps than Byron Murphy II did this past season. He played over 500 snaps, and he played 464 snaps in 2022 in 13 games. So over the past 2 seasons, he's played almost 1,000 snaps in 27 games for Texas. That's an impressive volume of workload for a player who, if we're being completely honest, is more of a run stuffer than he is a pass rusher at the next level. But he's a really pleasantly surprising pass rush winner for how big he is as a player. Here's the best way that I could put it into words for you. His pass rush win rate was equal to that of Johnny Newton at 366 pounds. And he's got, like, Byron Murphy has condensed frame, explosive first step, a lot of power conversion. Johnny Newton's got really good first step, really slippery, silky smooth hands, and he's somebody who can turn the corner really, really well. I think Newton probably corners the best out of all of them, and I think that was the biggest thing that caught Wilkins up from really having the explosion in sack production versus just the breakout that he had this past season, is getting hip to hip with somebody, and I got to turn that tight, like 90-degree angle to get around that body to the quarterback. How tight can you turn that? Does it become a 60-degree turn? Is it a 90-degree turn? Is it a 30-degree turn? Newton turns the corner the best out of the group in my mind and accelerates the heck out of there. In more shallow angles, I think Murphy has more ability to play through bodies. TVondre Sweat manhandles other people. He manhandles human beings. Case in point, like, there was a level of disruption here that in the passing game that you wouldn't necessarily expect. He had 5 passes defense this past year, gets his hands up, and it's not like he was a pure A-gap defender either. He took over 400 snaps this year in the B-gap. He spent 34 snaps ahead up on offensive tackles. So Texas moved him around a little bit because he had the athleticism to do it. Short yardage extraordinaire, blows up offensive linemen in one-on-one situations. His block deconstruction skills are the best of the group just because there's so much strain that he facilitates. If I'm a blocker going against TVondre Sweat, I have to strain so hard for a net neutral at the point of attack. And double teams don't really move him either. And then he gets in those situations where you have so much strain going into his frame. And he's big, but he's not like Raekwon Davis tall. He's not 6'7", he's 6'4". So his pads sit a little lower. And at 366, all of that mass is in the core and the abdomen and the lower half. And as you're straining, and you're trying to get off of him, when he sees how the ball carriers declaring themselves, like he just tosses dudes aside. But when he gets his helmet down and he gets his pads down in short yardage situations, and he's like, I'm getting in the gap. It's 3rd and 1. I'm getting in the gap. He blew up three short yardage runs against Kansas State this year, the game that they won in overtime. Getting through gaps and blowing up gaps. He's the best run defender of the group. He's not as explosive. Case in point, 366 pounds. That's to be expected. His 10-yard split, the first 10 seconds, take about 0.12 seconds longer for him to get through than Byron Murphy. And Johnny Newton, we don't have the testing numbers on. You're in a 5'3", 40-yard split with a 26-inch vertical jump. Like, the numbers aren't going to pop off the page at you at the same way that Jordan Davis did at the Combine a few years back when he cut weight down to 340 and then ran through blew the roof off the building at Lucas Oil Stadium. He's not that kind of athlete. Because of that, he's not going to go really early. But, like, if the stereotype is, well, he's a nose tackle type, so he's not going to play a lot of volume, I don't think that passed the sniff test. And case in point, I look at some of the comparables on his list when you go to mockdraftable.com, which has, like, the spider graph of his NFL Combine profile. Some of the top hits here are good players. Grover Stewart is a top 3 hit for a comparable to an athletic profile. And Stewart's getting like $13 million per year from the Colts, just signed a new contract this offseason. There's a familiar name Dolphins fans will know. Paul Soliai is on this list. Obviously, out of Utah in 2007, Soliai came to Miami and was a really good player for, I think, 6 seasons before he left in free agency. I want to say he played 6 seasons in Miami. 7 seasons in Miami. Played 99 games in Miami. Now, he only had 4.5 sacks in that period of time, but he made a Pro Bowl in 2011 with the Dolphins. Then he goes to Atlanta for a few years. He's out of the league in 2016. Phil Taylor, John Jenkins. Say what you will about, like, Dolphins fans know John Jenkins from, like, the last few years of, like, late stage John Jenkins and him obviously going from Miami and then to the Raiders this past year in 2023. But Jenkins has played 133 games in the NFL, four seasons in New Orleans, He's in Chicago, the Giants, Miami. And he's been a player who at times has taken 400, 500 snaps. He played 600 snaps last year. Eddie Goldman. There's good names on this list as far as comparables, and I think that's the right expectation for TVondre Sweat. Now, that doesn't make him an option at 21, but if you get an offensive lineman that blows your doors off or rocks your socks, or you get an outside pass rusher who's just way too good to pass up, and you come back around at 55 and you want a snap taker, he can be a snap taker. Now, he's not going to be a Christian Wilkins 1,000 snaps a season snap taker, but he can take half the workload and he can play in the B gap on early downs. 3 really good options for Miami to add to the board and list at these junctures in day 1 and day 2. I'd be thrilled with any of them being added to the ranks of Miami because they all kick butt in different ways. Newton, best pass rusher, best tight corners in the group. I think Murphy's the most explosive out of the group. I think he's probably the highest ceiling of any of the players while still having a respectfully high floor as a player. And then TVondre Sweat is the most physically dominant of the front. If you want the most intimidating presence and you're at peace with your third downs, maybe we're going to be a little bit more pressure oriented, so we don't need 2 winners on the interior. You want to live in that world? TVondre Sweat is a perfectly good way to go as well. That's going to do it for this interior defensive line conversation for the Dolphins and the 2024 NFL Draft. We're going to get into some more names. We're getting into Michael Hall from Ohio State, Chris Jenkins from University of Michigan. We got some more names coming your way here tomorrow on the show as we continue our prep work for the 2024 NFL Draft and introducing you to all of these prospects so that you know when the draft comes around who you want the Dolphins to pick based on process and the identity of the players and what we think good value is going to be. And then we'll see what the Dolphins actually do. So keep it locked in right here on Locked On Dolphins. It is your team every day. I appreciate every single one of you. Make it a great rest of your day. Fins up. I'll talk to you all again tomorrow.